Okay, I'm just going to give a reminder to folks that the quicker the answers, the quicker the questions, the more people can participate in this discussion. Continuing debate, the honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was temporarily almost promoted to parliamentary secretary, but I'll stay put so I can ask the honourable parliamentary secretary some questions. I want to start with the matter before us right now and hope that members will decide to support the amendments that have been put forward in today's debate at report stage. My honourable colleague, the member for Victoria, has just walked through some of them. I do want to stress that it's important to vote in favour of the reasoned NDP amendment put forward by the honourable member for Victoria, which is to restore a change that was made in the Senate. Now, anyone watching this could be confused. It's changes made in the Senate, it's going back to the Senate, what's going on here? This is a fundamental concern I have about the bill, is that the Minister of Environment, having had the amendments to the Environmental Protection Act put forward in the previous Parliament in the month of June of 2021, when the Liberal government was pretty sure they were going to bring themselves down and have a snap election in midsummer, so it was put on the order paper with no intention of really pursuing it. But it did give people and environmental law groups and others a chance to read that and say, wait a minute, there's more that needs to be done here. A lot of efforts in that regard, to which I'll refer later. Then we got back from the election. There's nothing on the order paper for the long-promised amendments to the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. So the minister and the Liberal machinery for putting forward legislation decide they ought to start this one in the Senate. Why? Because it's not such an important bill to the Liberal Party that they could start it in the House. They couldn't get House time, so they started it in the Senate. So then you have this convoluted process, and the Senate worked hard. And by the way, the Senate, having worked on this bill, sent a letter to the House that said, we couldn't get to some of the key amendments we really need to make, particularly to make the right to a healthy environment enforceable, because it's outside the scope of the bill. What does that mean to people who might be watching this and wondering why I'd be voting against the Canadian Environmental Protection Act amendments? In order to make the right to a healthy environment enforceable, one would have needed to open up Section 22, which is the section of this bill that deals with enforcement. That was not before the Senate as a possible place for amendment, any more than it was before the House of Commons Environment Committee, because Section 22, which has in the entire long history of this bill never been used because it's unusable, we really needed to open that up. But those were the amendments made in the Senate, many of them, and then the Senate said there's some things that really need to be changed that we can't get at. But the Senate did succeed in amending this bill to say we have to pay attention to tailings ponds. And that was deleted by the House of Environment Committee, and that's why the honourable member for Victoria has put forward the amendment that you find in motion number 1 before us today. The amendment to Clause 9 that was made in the committee restores what had been done in the Senate. I know the procedural path here is a bit circuitous. What I've brought forward is in amendments, and they're really the work. I want to credit who did the work on these. It was the Nature Canada and the Canadian Environmental Law Association, a number of other groups that wanted to see meaningful public participation in this legislation. So in order to do that, the amendments here at report stage change very slightly, well, I mean, not just slightly, they change it substantially, but it really, in terms of language, we move from saying what the bill says now, there'll be a consultation with interested parties having a particular meaning in law, which might not be the public, and wouldn't be Indigenous people, and wouldn't necessarily be scientists. So this amendment is a compromise. I want to stress that. This is a compromise from what we wanted to what we hope to get here at report stage, which is to allow, when there is a decision to genetically modify a living organism. For instance, we've had genetic modification of salmon in this country. We're the only country in the world, by the way, that allows genetic modification of a fish that is intended for human consumption. Pacific salmon are almost sacred, or we should say sacred, to indigenous peoples in the territories I represent. Indigenous knowledge is an important component to looking at that kind of a decision. So that's the First Amendment. And then the Second Amendment deals with the processes for considering indigenous knowledge and scientific information in the process. Now, it's really important that we identify where the barriers to this kind of thing lie. And some of them, unfortunately, are in the advice the minister received from people within Environment Canada. So this should be a process with significant public participation. The counter argument from John Moffat, who is the senior Environment Canada expert in this area, and he says that, quote, and I'm quoting this from Hansard and the evidence given to the Standing Committee on Environment on February 16th. John Moffat says, this is not a public participation process. This is a science-based process. Well, that would all be very well and good if scientists could also intervene at this point, but that's not clear that they can. To say that this is, quote, not a public process flies in the face of commitments that Liberals have made that there will be public participation. There will be Indigenous knowledge. We will listen to scientists. So before my time expires to speak to the rest of the bill, I really urge members on all sides of this House to give favorable consideration to these three amendments at report stage, because they will substantially increase the chance that we'll have meaningful public participation, including incorporating Indigenous knowledge into the bill. Now, I'm going to go through, with the 3.5 minutes I have left, Mr. Speaker, the deep disappointment I feel in Bill S5. It's tragic, really. I believe it or not, I know I don't look old enough for this to be true, or at least I'd like to believe it. I worked on this bill before first reading in 1988. Yeah, I worked on this bill in 1988 when it was brought forward under the office of the, well, it was at the time of the Mulroney government, a majority progressive conservative government, brought forward the Canadian Environment Protection Act, bringing together many disparate pieces of legislation, including the Ocean Dumping Act, the Air Quality Acts, creating Part 5, which is all we're really dealing with here today, Part 5 of the original Canadian Environment Protection Act that deals with toxic substances. We're not dealing with Part 6, which we should, to modernize genetically modified organisms and how we regulate those. We're not dealing with the parts dealing with the Ocean Dumping Act, which are crying out for amendments. We have a lot going on right now with our ports with cruise ships. But we know we're going to hear the trumpets and the horns and the hallelujahs that we have put a right to a healthy environment into this bill. What kind of a right is it if it's not enforceable? A non-enforceable right is a bumper sticker. It's good to have in the bill. People can point to it and say that's improvement, but it's not a right if you can't enforce it. The deep disappointment gets deeper when we look at the changes to the schedule for toxic chemicals. The Canadian Environmental Law Association and their briefs, and I agree with them, having worked on this legislation for longer than I care to mention, this bill survived constitutional challenge in the Hydro-Quebec case in the 1990s in the Supreme Court of Canada because it focused on toxic chemicals as a health issue, and because of that and the fact the Minister of Health and the Minister of Environment jointly administer this act, it was seen as legitimate exercise of federal jurisdiction. Why would it be changed now? Well, that would be thanks to the lobbying of the plastics industry that didn't like the idea that their products could be described as toxic. We know that for many decades now, courts understand the concept of quote-unquote CEPA toxic, Canadian Environment Protection Act version of toxic, which is in the environment in adequate amounts, in sufficient quantities, it's a threat to the environment and human health. Doesn't mean that if you pick up a piece of plastic, you're going to poison yourself. It means the enormous amount of plastics that we dump into the environment are a threat to our environment on a planetary scale. So to help a potential reputational public relations problem for the plastics industry, this bill weakens the constitutional foundations of the Act, and I'm unable to support a bill that takes any risk with the constitutional underpinnings of the Act to help the industry out with a public relations problem. There is also the elimination of key sections of original SEPA. Well, actually, the virtual elimination piece came in later after the first passage of the Act in 1990 and so on. We've had a lot of improvements to this Act over the years, but S5 is not one of them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.